And to Lisa, I'm so grateful for the opportunity to be here. This is something that you can only take on if there are other people who are there to help you, and several people who are in this room have done so. It's a collaborative venture. I'm extremely grateful. And I'm extremely grateful to all of you who Lisa and Gabby have invited here to give me the opportunity to tell you my thoughts. How many of you actually live in District 33? Great. And all of you, not only those who live in District 33, but of course you can't vote if you're not in District 33, but you're definitely part of making a campaign successful regardless of where you live. So I'm grateful to all of you for giving me this opportunity to speak to you. I don't call the other people running in this race my opponents. I don't think we need to go there. The way I see it, I'm a candidate for a job, and there are other candidates for the job. And for those of you particularly who are in District 33, this is a job interview. You're interviewing the candidate, as you should be. And this is a historic opportunity we have here, because it's an open seat here in one of the most powerful districts, most visible districts in the country. There's an open seat for the first time in 38 years. So this is a big deal. There are a lot of really good people running. And you're doing what you should be doing. You're thinking and hearing and deciding what you will do on June 3rd. And I want that date to be really big in your consciousness. Unless you're not going to, if you're going to vote for someone else, forget what I just said. June 3rd, that is the primary. And even though there are 18 candidates, and the ones I've met have been absolutely lovely people. But my basic submission to you is that there are 18 candidates, but only 2 conversations. One is theirs and one is mine. Theirs is perpetuate the system. Mine is disrupt the system. It really needs it. Somebody said to me a few minutes ago, she said, you really want to go into politics and swim with the sharks? And my response to you was, better I swim with them than that they continue to eat us. And that's why I am running for Congress. We have a serious problem on our hands. Now, Gabby was talking about how in her career in the field of transformation, I see Mast and Kip here, the psychotherapy that Lisa is studying. I met someone else here who's a psychotherapist. I can imagine how many people are here tonight who in one way or another are either involved in your lives or actually practicing and professionally guiding others in theirs in transforming their lives, going from crisis to opportunity. For people who are in the recovery movement, psychotherapy, personal growth, spirituality, this is a conversation that we all understand. And sometimes people will come up to me at my lectures, and not at my lectures, but on the campaign trail, and say something like, oh, your books, changed my life. And my response is, great, now let's go change the country. Because a country is simply a collection of individuals. So the same principles that rule within one individual life rule within a country. And one of the things we know about personal transformation is you can't just bring the light to the dark, you have to bring the darkness to the light. As they say in Alcoholics Anonymous, an individual is as sick as their secrets. Well, guess what? So is a country. And so just like an individual has to take a brutally honest look at themselves and see where they themselves need to change, where they themselves need to course correct in order to change their individual life, I think we as a country need to do the same. And if we do not do that work in our own individual lives, consequences happen. And the consequences of personal growth are beautiful. And the consequences of refusing to do the personal work can be truly awful. And there are enough people in this room who, from our own experience, have seen this, have seen what happened in my life when I acted unwisely and unconsciously. Sometimes we shudder to think of the things that have happened in our lives when we acted unconsciously and unwisely. And then we are living testaments to what happened in our lives when we started acting wisely and consciously. One of my fellow candidates said at one of the candidate forums that we did the other day, he finished his sharing, which otherwise I thought was just great, but he finished his sharing by saying, America's best years are ahead of us. My belief is, not necessarily. They're ahead of us if you do what it takes to create a great life. But they're not great ahead of us if we continue to act in ways that I believe are profoundly reckless and profoundly irresponsible. Now, I've had a very nice life and a very nice career, not being in politics. But I also grew up feeling what I think most of us have felt for the last few years, which is if I saw something truly ridiculous that was being done in this country by the government or by corporate forces or whatever, the punchline for me would always be, well, I mean, it's so obviously unconstitutional that we don't really have to worry about it, because surely someone will do something about it. Now, I don't know about you, I don't assume that anymore. I don't necessarily assume that the U.S. government is going to do what I was raised to believe is its job and protect us against egregious overreach by any forces who in some undemocratic way might wish to supplant the will of the people of the United States. Not only do I no longer assume that they will protect us, I never know these days when they are chopping the wood and carrying the water for those forces. Now, I think a lot of us are thinking that. And I feel at this point in my career, what I felt in my career for 30 years. I'm not saying anything everybody I know isn't saying, but I'm saying it in the microphone. Because, ladies and gentlemen, we need to. We need to. This is not just a kind of sort of bad thing. We're living in a phase that represents nothing short of the de-democratization of the United States of America. There was a study that just came out, it's all over the internet, about Princeton University and research they've done, declaring that we're not a democracy right now, we are an oligarchy. Whether you call it an oligarchy or a corporatocracy, whatever you want to call it, it's not democracy. So I think it's time for all of us to take a step back and really consider what this means. First of all, this country was born. This country's story is magnificent. You know how you go to therapy and you study the story of your family. And where your family got it right, you want to stand on their shoulders. Where your family got it wrong, you want to break the chain. Isn't that right? A family is that way too. Because in many ways, the American story is grand and magnificent, and we should all be proud of it, and we should all be standing within that field of possibility and doing what we can to contribute to the furtherance of that magnificence. But there are also things that our country has done and continues to do, where if we are conscious about it, we go, oh no, that stops right here. Just like we would say in our individual lives. No, we need to interrupt that pattern. Now, this country was founded with a profound dichotomy at its core. And that is that the most profound and enlightened principles were encoded into our founding documents. And those principles were not just significant, even radical, in the political evolution of the human race. They were and are significant and radical in the philosophical and spiritual furtherance of the human race. Because until then, the Western world certainly was dominated by a monarchical and aristocratic system. And a monarchical and aristocratic system, I remember when I was a little kid being taught about the divine right of kings. And I remember learning that in school. So God gives power to the king or the queen. And then the king or the queen shares power with their cronies, the aristocracy. And the entire social order was such that the aristocracy got to do whatever they wanted. They got to feast, they were considered entitled to feast on the resources of the country. And then when they were finished feasting, whatever crumbs were, falling off their table, everybody else in the society was basically an economic serf who just was reduced to competing and struggling over those crumbs in order to survive. So this country was founded on the notion that God did not just give power to the king, that God gave power to everyone. Radical then, radical now. Think about what a different universe you live in. If I think other people have the power, then by definition, they have power over me. That's one life. And there's a limited wingspan I get to have. And then there's another constellation, which is, I don't have any more, any less than anybody else. And I can be whatever I want to be and do whatever I want to do as long as it doesn't hurt anyone else. That's a container for self-actualization. And that's why it matters. That's why it matters to us, and that's why it matters to the world, and that's why it matters to the future. Now, the geniuses actually, who encoded the very idea of equality before the law, and equality of rights, and equality of opportunities, the very men who encoded those principles were themselves, a few of them, slave owners. So we were born of this dichotomy between these principles and the fact that there have been certainly times in our history where we did not make them manifest or embody them ourselves. And that was an irony that was not lost on them. So you start with this tension. Here are your principles, here's your behavior. And what do we know from personal growth? If there's a gap between your principles and your behavior, you might want to look at that. But the magnificence of the historical political narrative of the United States is that generation after generation, our political journey has been that there have been those who have sought to close the gap between who we say we are and what we actually do, and there have been those who resisted that effort. Yes, we had slavery. We did. But that was not the end of the story. The end of the story came about when a generation rose up. From the Quakers, by the way. The Quakers rose up, and with the abolitionist movement, obviously combined with the Civil War, abolished slavery. Women didn't have the right to vote. And if a woman doesn't have a right to vote, think what other rights we didn't have. But that wasn't the end of the story. The women's suffrage movement rose up, again founded in large part from the Quakers. And with the passage of the 19th Amendment, women were given the right to vote. Then there was legalized segregation in the American South, Jim Crow laws, the legalized, institutionalized oppression of black people in the American South. Not the end of the story, though, because a preacher named Martin Luther King rose up, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, and a generation working in the movement called the Civil Rights Movement paved the way for legalized for the civil rights legislation that ended legalized segregation in the United States. So it's not that America has never gotten it wrong before. It's that our historical trajectory is that in time we tend to get it right. Winston Churchill once said, you can always count on the Americans to do the right thing after they have exhausted every other option. Now, there are people around this world who roll their eyes about Americans. They can't believe how disengaged we can be, how disconnected we can be, how oblivious we can be. But those same people would be the first people to acknowledge that when we do wake up, we slam it like nobody's business. And that's why after the attack on Pearl Harbor, a Japanese admiral famously said, I fear we have awakened a sleeping giant. Now today, ladies and gentlemen, we are living at a time where the gap is very disturbing. We are living at a time where moneyed forces now exert an influence on the functioning of our government that is so totally disproportionate to the influence that is exerted by the average citizen as to represent a death spiral for American democracy. Our government is for sale. Our government is bought and paid for. We have in the United States today a system of legalized bribery and corruption. And this didn't happen by accident. This happened over decades, by which through banking policies and trade policies and tax policies, and particularly a couple of very, very sinister Supreme Court decisions that will go down in our history as two of the worst in American history. Citizens United in 2010 and the McCutcheon decision last week, which basically put the nails in the coffin of American democracy. Now, what this means then is that you have a situation of citizen lockout, where the average citizen does not wield the political influence that every average citizen in America should wield. The average citizen does not have the educational opportunities for their children that every American should be able to expect. The average American does not necessarily experience the kind of economic opportunity that every American should expect. Why? Well, if you've siphoned off your major resources into the hands of 1%, who then control 38 to 40% of the wealth, and 60% of the people are living on 2.3% of the wealth, what do we expect? Now, at the battle at Gettysburg, when Abraham Lincoln stood on that battlefield after tens of thousands of men had died, what we can only assume to have been horrific deaths. He said that they had not died in vain. He said that they had died so that a government of the people and by the people and for the people would not perish from the earth. Well, it's perishing. Because we are now a government of a few of the people and for a few of the people and by a few of the people. If we're going to make a mockery of the Gettysburg Address, we really need to discuss this. And it's like an alcohol at home. They're not discussing it, have you noticed? Your traditional political status quo is not bringing this up. Why? Because the traditional political status quo, in order to get elected and stay elected, because of this undue influence of money on our elections, needs the money. So what they do is they will address the effects, but they will not address the cause. They will address the symptoms, but they will not address the disease. For that, we need a people's intervention. Abolition didn't come from a major party, it came from the people, the abolitionist movement. Suffrage didn't come from a major political party, it came from the people, the suffragette movement. Civil rights movement didn't come from a major political party, it came from the civil rights movement. And we have been trained to be these kind of Stepford citizens. Have you noticed? We're just spectators. And the political class is kind of doing what they're doing, and we look at it like it's a spectator sport. And you know what, ladies and gentlemen, if this continues, let me tell you what else is going to continue. The shrinking of our civil liberties, including things like the National Defense Authorization Act, by which the U.S. government has given itself the legal authority to indefinitely detain U.S. citizens, expanding corporate influence. I mean, all this idea that we're going to really be able to deal with climate change and environmental degradation, good luck with anything other than incremental change, while the fossil fuel companies, the oil companies, and the gas companies are able to dominate policy the way they are. All the people in this town are all upset about GMOs.